Babylon. The very name evokes images of immense city walls, glittering temples, and a grand civilization of great antiquity. In its day, Babylon was known as the Gate of the God, a fitting title for a city that became a crossroads of ancient cultures and power. Situated on the banks of the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, Babylon rose from obscure beginnings to become the capital of successive empires and a center of learning and religion. So today, we're going to trace the sweeping history of Babylon, from the earliest settlements through its zeniths and eventual decline. It's been condensed somewhat into an hour-long video. The idea is to give you a general outline. It is a story not only of kings and battles, but also of cultural flowering, lore codes and legends, astronomers and priests, all unfolding within and around the walls of this remarkable city. And we're going to focus on the Babylonian history through the lens of the Babylonians themselves. Luckily for us, we have plenty of ancient sources and archaeological findings to rely on. We'll do our best to avoid later mythologizing interpretations. Our aim is to explore critically how Babylon rose to greatness, what life and achievements it nurtured, and ultimately, how the entire thing came crumbling down into a ruin. But first, let me welcome you. For anyone new to the channel, it's good to meet you. I invite you to click that subscribe button, and anybody else, leave your thoughts in the comments. You know it's good for the algorithm, helps more people see the video, and once again, thank you to those supporting on the Patreon and who checked out the merch store. Now, without further ado, let's get nice and comfortable. And over the next hour, you'll definitely have a good understanding of the rise and fall of Babylon. Of course, Babylon had to have rose out of somewhere, and long before Babylon became an imperial capital, it was simply a modest town, another one dotted along the Mesopotamian plain. Archaeology and cuneiform texts suggest that the site of Babylon was inhabited as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, though it remained overshadowed by much older cities like Nippur, Kish, and Ur. The earliest known reference to Babylon actually appears in the reign of Shar-Kali-Shari, and that is around 2200 BCE, an Akkadian king. One of his year names commemorates the construction of temples at a place called Ka-Din-Gir, that is, Gate of the God. And, well, taking names literally, we can presume that this place would be Babylon. You see, at this early stage, Babylon was neither independent nor particularly large. It was administered by governors, called Ensi in the tongue, under the Akkadian Empire's guidance. Later Mesopotamian chroniclers even ascribed Babylon's founding to the famous Sargon of Akkad, that is 2330 BCE, around then, though this is likely legendary. Still, these tales reflect Babylon's eventual prestige. Later generations imagined that even the great Sargon had recognized Babylon's significance. After the Akkadian Empire collapsed, this is around 2150 BCE, southern Mesopotamia fell under the sway of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, and then fragmented into smaller city-states. Babylon disappears from the record for a few centuries, but its fortunes seem to have changed with the arrival of Semitic-speaking newcomers, known as the Amorites. By around 1894 BCE, an Amorite chieftain named Sumu Abum seized Babylon, and from there he established a local dynasty. His successor, Sumu La El, and later heirs expanded the town's influence, building fortification walls and ultimately asserting their autonomy. But at first, Babylon was just one petty kingdom among many. In fact, for a century it was eclipsed by its more powerful neighbors, the city-state of Larsa in the south, the old Sumerian city of Isin, and Elam to the east. Early Babylonian rulers did not even style themselves king, at least initially. But regardless of all of this, these days laid the groundwork for Babylon's rise by fortifying the settlement, perhaps even fostering a local identity centered on the patron god Marduk. So let's talk about the old Babylonian kingdom. That is the kingdom that is under the great Hammurabi. You see, Babylon's great leap to prominence came under its sixth ruler, King Hammurabi, reigning from circa 1792 to 1750 BCE. He inherited a modest realm, but through shrewd diplomacy and a sprinkling of force, no doubt, he transformed Babylon into the capital of a new empire. Over the course of his long reign, he systematically defeated rival kings and unified all of southern Mesopotamia under his authority. He conquered cities steeped in history, Uruk, Larsa, Isin, and even Mari far to the northwest, finally forging them into a single kingdom ruled from its seat at Babylon. This political unification marked the first time the region became known collectively as Babylonia, that is, the land of Babylon. Babylon, being once minor, now supplanted venerable Nippur as the religious and cultural center of the south. Hammurabi is best known today for the Code of Hammurabi, that collection of laws inscribed on that huge stone stele. This artifact, found by archaeologists, reveals how the king wished to be seen as a divinely appointed guardian of justice. In the prologue of the code, Hammurabi proclaims that the gods called him to, quote, bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. Well, such ideals, even if partly royal propaganda, indicate an advanced concept of law and society. The laws themselves, nearly 300 provisions in total, cover everything from contract disputes and wages to crime and family law. And all of them together certainly paint a vivid picture of Babylonian daily life. Well, if we take one example, the code addresses the liability of builders. You see, if a house that is built collapses and kills the owner, the builder of that house would be liable. And it wasn't a slap on the wrist either. He would be executed. And there was also the rights of merchants, and even wives. While pretty harsh by modern standards, as many offences were punishable by death or mutilation, and they were pretty cavalier with these punishments, the laws aimed to provide some order and predictability in a new, complex urban society. The roots of new civilizations, just trying to find their feet. But after all, you cannot have a civilization without a system of laws. You cannot have it without order. Well, under Hammurabi, Babylon seems to have blossomed, although the city's archaeological remains from this period are scant, as later construction obscured them. Written records speak of temples, palaces, and canals. Marduk, originally a local city god, rose in prominence in Babylon's imperial cult. It was probably during or soon after Hammurabi's time that the epic poem Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, was composed, elevating Marduk as the king of the gods. In this myth, the other deities grant Marduk supremacy, and as celebration of order over chaos, they plan the building of Babylon as his holy city. They proclaim in the text, "Let us build a shrine to serve as his chamber. Let it be the abode of Marduk." This effectively mythologizes Babylon's foundation as a part of the creation of the world. Such religious storytelling shows Babylon's self-image as a divinely chosen city, a place where heaven's decisions were enacted on the earth. And another realm in which old Babylonian culture excelled was science and learning. The Babylonians, you see, inherited the rich intellectual traditions of Sumer and Akkad, and tablets from Hammurabi's era show advances in mathematics and astronomy. A clay tablet, known as Plimpton 322, for instance, contains numerical tables that include Pythagorean triples, that is, integer solutions to the Pythagorean theorem. Now from that, we can certainly see evidence that Babylonian scholars understood sophisticated mathematical concepts well over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They used a sexagesimal, that is, base 60 number system that gave us the 60-minute hour, and also the 360-degree circle. In astronomy, they observed the movements of stars and planets for calendrical and omen purposes. All this early scholarship was recorded in cuneiform writing on clay, often in the Akkadian language, and sometimes in Sumerian, which lingered on as a scholarly tongue. As for Babylon's scribes, they were trained in vast lexical texts and lists. One can imagine students in Hammurabi's time memorizing proverbs and honing their writing on clay exercises as the city's intellectual life continued to grow. And so, we could make a solid argument that Hammurabi's reign was the apex of the old Babylonian Empire. It's pretty hard to say any other reign of any other king had as much of an impact at this time. And after his death, the successors had a hard act to follow. They struggled to maintain such a far-flung realm. Internal rebellions and external pressures began to mount. The far south, the marshy land near the Gulf, broke away to form a sea-land dynasty, and new threats ultimately appeared. Finally, in 1595 BCE, Babylon suffered a sudden blow. The city was attacked and sacked by the Hittites, a power from Anatolia that swept down unexpectedly. The Hittite king Mursili I stormed Babylon and carried off its treasures. According to later Hittite accounts, he destroyed Babylon too, taking captives and treasure back to Hattusa, that is the Hittite capital. This raid toppled the first dynasty of Babylon. The Amorite line came to an end with King Samsu-Didana. However, the Hittites did not stay to rule. Babylon was left in disarray, a prize for others ready for the taking. And taken it was. In this power vacuum following Babylon's collapse, a new dynasty emerged. This dynasty was the Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains region, assuming control of Babylon around 1590 to 1570 BCE. Unfortunately, the ultimate details of their rise are a little bit obscure, but they would reign for nearly 4 centuries, one of the longest dynasties in Babylon's history. The Kassites renamed southern Mesopotamia as Kar-Duniash, and although foreign in origin, they became fully Babylonian, at least in culture, over time. Under the Kassite rule, Babylon was rebuilt and endured as an important city, but it did not aggressively expand its empire. Instead, the period was marked by relative stability, flourishing artistic and literary activity, and frequent interactions, whether diplomatic or military, with surrounding powers. Several Kassite kings, with names like Burna-Buriash, Karigalzu, and Katashum-Enlil, appear in both Babylonian records and in correspondence with Egypt. Notably, letters from the Kassite Babylonian to Egyptian pharaohs were found amongst the Amarna Letters archive in Egypt, and that's from the 14th century BCE. These clay tablets show Babylonian kings corresponding as equals with Egyptian kings, addressing each other as brother, and exchanging gifts and princesses. Babylon was part of an international system that included Egypt, the Mitanni, the Hittites, and Assyria. But culturally, the Kassite era saw great preservation and codification of knowledge. Babylonian scholars compiled god lists, scientific texts, and perhaps the definitive edition of the Enuma Elish dates to this time. The Epic of Gilgamesh, although rooted in older Sumerian tales, was found in later libraries in a standard Babylonian version that may have been edited during the late second millennium. Babylon's religious prestige also grew. Marduk's statue and his temple Esagila remained central to ceremonial life. Kings took on titles like caretaker of Esagila to emphasize their duty to Babylon's main deity. However, Babylon's political fortunes during the Kassite times were admittedly mixed. The kingdom was often threatened by powerful neighbors. To the north, you see, the Middle Assyrian Empire was rising, and to the east, the kingdom of Elam in southwest Iran grew more and more bold. By the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, Babylonia became a battleground between these powers. The Kassites managed to hold on for centuries, but they gradually lost territory and influence. Eventually, in 1155, according to later reckoning, the Kassite dynasty was completely overthrown. The Elamites, under King Shutruk-Nahunte, invaded Babylon, supposedly carrying off the statue of Marduk as spoils. With this, the rule of the Kassites crumbled. In the aftermath, a native Babylonian leadership was restored, the so-called Second Dynasty of Isin, Isin being a city whose kings took Babylon's throne. Among these rulers, Nebuchadnezzar I, not to be confused with the later Nebuchadnezzar II, by the way, stood out as unique. Reigning around 1125 to 1104, Nebuchadnezzar is famed for his campaigns against Elam to avenge earlier humiliations. He successfully defeated Elam and retrieved the stolen idols, including the revered statue of Marduk, bringing them back to Babylon. This act made him a champion in the eyes of the Babylonians, restoring national pride and the favor of the gods. Songs and chronicles celebrated his piety and valor, and he also rebuilt temples and presumably sponsored a revival of Babylonian culture. But even so, the resurgence was short-lived. The 11th century BCE brought new challenges as Aramaean and Sutian nomadic tribes infiltrated Mesopotamia. These West Semitic groups disrupted trade and agriculture, and at times seized cities. There are indications that an Aramaean chief even took control of Babylon briefly in the late 11th century BC, illustrating the fragmentation of power. Written records from this era dwindle. ushering in a dark age where our knowledge is patchy. It is known as the Middle Babylonian or post-Kassite period, a time of smaller polities and constant struggle. But amid all of that struggle, Babylonia itself, or Babylon rather itself, endured as a city, despite being periodically dominated by outsiders or local warlords. The city's religious significance as the seat of Marduk meant every conqueror found it prudent to legitimize himself there. Assyrian inscriptions from this period start to mention Babylon more frequently, foreshadowing the next era, where Babylon would fall under the shadow of the Assyrian might. And so, by the 9th century BC, a revitalized Neo-Assyrian empire, based in northern Mesopotamia, began to exert influence over Babylon and its lands. Assyria was culturally akin to Babylonia, but politically, they were rivals. In fact, they often saw southern Mesopotamia as a rich province, but equally as troublesome. From roughly 900 to 600 BCE, Babylon's fate was entwined with Assyria's rise and fall. In this period, Babylonia was sometimes ruled by Assyrian kings directly, sometimes given to client kings, and often rocked by rebellions as Babylonian elites and tribal chiefs, or most notably the Chaldeans, vied for their own autonomy. One early encounter was actually in 853, when King Shalmaneser III of Assyria records battling Babylonian forces. Later Assyrian rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 745 to 727, took a more direct role. In fact, Tiglath-Pileser III invaded Babylon during a time of internal strife, and in 729 he crowned himself the King of Babylon. He even adopted a local throne name. That's a very good way to fit in, surely. Now, this dual kingship tactic was an attempt to placate Babylonian pride, acknowledging Babylon's special status, yes, while effectively making it part of the Assyrian Empire. Despite such measures, Babylonian resistance continued to simmer. Indigenous leaders such as Marduk Apla-iddina II, also known as Merodach-Baladan, a Chaldean warlord, seized the city wherever Assyrian grip weakened. Merodach-Baladan managed to rule Babylon on multiple occasions, championing Babylonian independence. He formed alliances with Elam and other neighbors to counter Assyria. In 722, upon the death of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, Merodach-Baladan occupied Babylon and was ultimately recognized as king. The new Assyrian monarch, Sargon II, not to be confused with the old Sargon, had to campaign for years to finally expel the rebel leader. Sargon II eventually defeated Merodach-Baladan in 710 and entered Babylon as its ruler, portraying himself, just like Tiglath-Pileser did, as a legitimate Babylonian king. He then participated in Babylon's New Year festival, the Akitu festival, and all in all respected the city's traditions. However, this does not mean that local unrest simply vanished overnight. After Sargon's death, Merodach-Baladan reappeared, and he stirred revolt again. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, reigning from 704 to 681, faced an almost constant state of rebellion in Babylonia, fueled by the Chaldeans and aided by Elam. Sennacherib's initial approach was to appoint a local puppet. He made a nobleman, Bel-Ibni, king, and later one of his own sons. But each arrangement failed. Fed up after a particularly widespread rebellion in 689, Sennacherib unleashed a drastic measure. He attacked and destroyed Babylon. According to Assyrian records, he ravaged the entire city thoroughly. The walls, temples, palaces, everything razed, and they even carried off the ruins. That's right, all of those broken stones and rubble was carried off and dumped into the Euphrates River. Sennacherib boasted that Babylon's destruction was so complete that its ruins would be impossible to identify. For a city that was a religious heartland, this was shocking, even by ancient standards. This act was viewed as impious by most Mesopotamians. Indeed, Sennacherib's own murder in 681 by two of his sons while he prayed in a temple was interpreted by Babylonians as divine punishment, Marduk's vengeance for the offense to his city. Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, immediately sought to reverse the situation. Recognizing that ruling Mesopotamia without Babylon's goodwill was untenable, Esarhaddon rebuilt the city of Babylon. He proclaimed his intent to restore the city's glory and began reconstruction of temples and streets as early as 680 BC. Within a decade or two, Babylon was back. Not quite to its former glory, but at least it was functioning. Sanctuaries rebuilt, and people resettled. As for Esarhaddon, he went even further. In a unique arrangement, he split his empire's rule between his two sons. The elder, Shamash-shum-ukin, was given Babylon as a sort of junior king, while the younger, Ashurbanipal, inherited Assyria's throne in Nineveh. The idea was to appease Babylon by having a royal family member rule there, respecting its autonomy to a degree. For a time, everything was working well. No problems. Babylonia and Assyria coexisted under this fraternal arrangement for about 16 years. But of course, tensions brewed, as Shamash-shum-ukin chaffed at being subordinate to his brother. In 652 BC, he led a grand alliance of peoples against Ashurbanipal. The Babylonians, Chaldeans, Elamites, Arameans, they all joined in revolt. And thus a bitter civil war ensued. After a prolonged siege, Babylon was starved into submission in 648. Ashurbanipal triumphed. Shamash-shum-ukin reportedly perished in the flames of his palace. Notably, Ashurbanipal did not destroy Babylon. Instead, he performed a ritual of reconciliation. He installed a puppet king, Kandalanu, on Babylonian's throne, and took treasures and scholars north, but ultimately he left the city intact. Ashurbanipal had a keen interest in Babylonian culture. His famous library in Nineveh contains copies of numerous Babylonian literary and even scientific texts that he had collected. And this shows an important point. Even when Babylon was politically under heel, its cultural influence endured. Assyrian princes learned Babylonian literature. Gods like Marduk were respected, if, well, sometimes a little bit grudgingly. And those Babylonian astronomers and scribes, they were particularly valued. Of course, Ashurbanipal couldn't be around forever. He died 631 BCE, and Assyria descended into internal strife. Babylon once more seized its chance to take its own independence. A Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar rose up in Babylon in 626, declaring himself king and throwing off Assyrian control. And it's as we get to this point that it marks the start of Babylon's greatest error since Hammurabi, aptly called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under Nabopolassar, reigning 626 to 605, and his successors, Babylon experienced a renaissance politically, architecturally, and culturally. Nabopolassar allied with the Medes, being an Iranian people, to wage war on Assyria, and the campaign was hugely successful. Assyria's major cities, including the mighty Nineveh, were sacked by 612, and by 609 the Assyrian Empire was effectively extinguished. Babylon now stood as the preeminent imperial power in Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar, an older man by the time of the victory, set about restoring Babylon's primacy. Much of the glory, however, would come under his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. He's perhaps Babylon's most iconic ruler, reigning from 604 to 562. In his long reign of over 40 years, he consolidated the empire and embarked on ambitious building projects that made Babylon famous across the ancient world. Militarily, Nebuchadnezzar continued his father's work. He campaigned in the Levant, defeating Egypt's army at Carchemish in 605, and eventually subduing the kingdoms of Syria and Judah. It was Nebuchadnezzar II who actually besieged Jerusalem, by the way, and destroyed the temple in 587, also exiling the Judeans, events noted in the Hebrew Bible, but, well, we'll focus on Babylon's own perspective here. Each victory, though, brought tribute and skilled captives back to Babylon, enriching the empire. As for Babylon itself, it was utterly transformed under Nebuchadnezzar's direction. The king took immense pride in beautifying the capital. Quote, he boasts in one inscription, "I built a strong wall that cannot be shaken with bitumen and baked bricks. I laid its foundation on the breast of the netherworld, and I built its top as high as a mountain." This was no idle boast. He indeed strengthened Babylon's defenses, constructing a double line of city walls that made it virtually impossible to siege through. These walls, later classical writers claimed, were so broad that chariots could race atop them abreast. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt and enlarged the principal temples, especially Esagila, the temple of Marduk, and the Etemenanki Ziggurat, a towering stepped pyramid dedicated to Marduk, possibly over 90 meters tall. The Etemenanki, in particular, was fabled. Some scholars believe it was the inspiration behind the later legends of a Tower of Babel due to its imposing height. One of Nebuchadnezzar's most famous projects was the Ishtar Gate and the Grand Processional Way. The Ishtar Gate, a massive double gateway on the north side of the city, was faced with dazzling blue glazed bricks and decorated with reliefs of bulls, lions, and dragons, symbolic beasts associated with the gods Adad and Marduk. Through this gate ran the processional way, a brick-paved street flanked by walls bearing similar colorful reliefs, which led to the temple precinct. During the New Year festival, statues of the gods would be paraded down this avenue amid music and ritual, an awe-inspiring civic spectacle. In fact, the Ishtar Gate was so splendid that parts of it excavated in the 20th century are now reconstructed and displayed in a museum, allowing us lucky modern viewers to marvel at the Babylonian craftsmanship. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was not only about piety and defense, but it was also built to impress and control. He built a vast palace for himself, along with lush courtyards. There is a long-standing story, too, from later Greek sources, that Nebuchadnezzar constructed the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a series of terraced gardens with exotic plants, supposedly to console his Median wife who missed the green hills of her homeland. These gardens, if they existed, would have been quite an engineering feat, an artificial paradise of greenery in the middle of the dry plain, watered by pumps going all the way to the Euphrates. They were later listed as one of the 7 wonders of the world. However, historians debate if the Hanging Gardens were real, or if the legend arose with confusions with gardens in Assyrian Nineveh. No definitive archaeological trace of them has been found in Babylon, but the absence of evidence is not conclusive in such a heavily reused site. But what is certain is that Nebuchadnezzar lavished attention on Babylon's religious institutions. Each year at the spring equinox, Babylon hosted the Akitu, the New Year festival, during which the king had to perform rituals acknowledging Marduk's supremacy. Part of this involved the king taking the hand of Marduk in the temple, a ceremony confirming his right to rule. Think of it like a divine mandate of kings. In Nebuchadnezzar's time, the Akitu festival was a grand affair, attracting pilgrims and involving processions and rites that tied the king's fortunes to the city's god. A fascinating detail is the ritual humiliation of the king. The high priest would strip Nebuchadnezzar of regalia and slap him, making the mighty ruler shed tears, a sign of humility before the god. Only if the king cried, thus demonstrating he had not overstepped his bounds, would Marduk symbolically renew his mandate. Such traditions illustrate the sophisticated balance of power between the church and state in Babylon. The clergy of Babylon's temples, especially the priests of Marduk, held significant sway of their own. Indeed, the Babylonian priesthood would later play a role in political transitions, as we shall see with Nabonidus. Nebuchadnezzar II died in 562, at the height of his power. He left a legacy of a king who finally brought back the glory days of old Babylon. The city at its death was likely the largest in the world, perhaps covering over 1,000 hectares, and housing maybe 100,000 or more inhabitants. A metropolis of its time. Its triple walls, towering ziggurat, ornate gates, bustling bazaars, and libraries of cuneiform tablets made it the envy of its contemporaries. One Greek visitor, a couple centuries later, being Herodotus, would describe Babylon in near legendary terms. He spoke of its immense circuit wall, saying it was 56 miles long. Likely an exaggeration. Herodotus exaggerates quite a bit. But he also spoke of the inhabitants' unusual customs, like burying their dead in honey and engaging in ritual prostitution. Colorful claims that modern historians view with a great bit of skepticism. Yet Herodotus's writings reveal how Babylon's mystique endured. The truth is that Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was as real as it was extraordinary, and it left a profound impression on everyone who encountered it. After Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon faced a rapid succession of rulers and an increasingly fragile political situation. His immediate successor, Marduk, also called Evil-Merodach in later texts, ruled only briefly before being assassinated in a palace plot. A general and brother-in-law, Neriglissar, took the throne but died a few years later, leaving the kingdom to an underage son, who was quickly overthrown. In 556 BC, a notable usurper, Nabonidus, became king. Nabonidus was an unusual ruler in several ways. He reigned from 556 to 539, a middle-aged man at accession, not of the royal family, and he had scholarly religious inclinations. His mother was a priestess of the moon god Sin, and Nabonidus himself showed devotion to Sin, particularly at the city of Haran, at the expense of Marduk's traditional primacy. This religious shift caused quite a bit of friction within the Babylonian clergy. Nabonidus also departed from Babylon for an entire decade, residing in the distant oasis of Taima in Arabia. Why he did this remains debated. Some say it was a strategic occupation of Arabian trade routes. Others suggest a personal religious retreat. But in his absence, he left his son Belshazzar in charge of Babylon's affairs as regent. This long absence, and Nabonidus' perceived neglect of Marduk, provided a pretext for the later propaganda against him. By the late 540s BCE, Babylon's empire was facing a new threat, the ascendant Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. You see, Cyrus, he'd done a very good job at conquering the Medes, and at this point he'd unified much of Iran. He then defeated the neighboring kingdom of Lydia and eyed off Mesopotamia as the next prize on the list. In 539 he marched on Babylon. Nabonidus belatedly returned to lead his army, but internal divisions slightly weakened Babylonia's defense. At the Battle of Opis on the Tigris, Cyrus's forces decisively beat the Babylonian army. Soon after, Babylon itself fell to the Persians. According to Babylonian records, and Cyrus's own account, the city surrendered without much of a fight. The gates were opened by Babylonian dignitaries disillusioned with Nabonidus, and the Persians entered peacefully. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a cuneiform tablet written by Babylonian scholars, confirms that in 539 BCE, the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without battle, and that Nabonidus was captured. Cyrus made a point of performing religious propriety. He went to the temple of Marduk and had himself crowned as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Cyrus reinforced this message in the famous Cyrus cylinder, a clay cylinder inscription buried as a foundation deposit in Babylon. On the cylinder, Cyrus is presented as chosen by Marduk to restore order. It criticizes Nabonidus, without naming him directly, for impiety and neglecting the city and people of Babylon. One passage reads, quote, "Without battle and conflict, he, Marduk, permitted him, Cyrus, to enter Babylon. He spared his city Babylon a calamity. Nabonidus, the king who did not fear him, he delivered into his hand." Cyrus goes on to enumerate how he returned to displaced gods their temples and allowed exiled peoples to go home. Indeed, Babylon's archives indicate that Cyrus respected the local traditions. He and his successors took the title King of Babylon among their many titles and participated in the New Year festival, at least initially. Thus ended Babylonians' era of native kings. The Persian Achaemenid Empire incorporated Babylonia as one of its richest provinces. Under Persian rule, 539 to 331 BCE, Babylon at first retained importance. It served as one of the empire's administrative centers. Cyrus and his sons, Cambyses, generally kept Babylon in good standing. Cambyses might have been present to take the hand of Marduk in one New Year ceremony. But when Darius I came to power in 522, Babylon rebelled, not once, but twice, led by pretenders, such as Nidindu-Bel and Araka, who both curiously took the name Nebuchadnezzar. That was mainly to invoke the Babylonian legitimacy. Well, they didn't get very far. Darius quashed these revolts with some difficulty and reportedly took severe reprisals. Later, under Xerxes, 486 to 465, Babylon rebelled again around 482. This time, the Persian retribution was heavy. Ancient sources claim that Xerxes removed the golden statue of Marduk and perhaps destroyed parts of Babylon's ziggurat. He abolished the Babylonian crown. No more Persian kings titled themselves the king of Babylon after Xerxes, and made Babylonia a mere satrapy without special status. Some historians believe the damage to Babylon's religious infrastructure under Xerxes was a turning point, initiating the city's decline. While Babylon remained populous and economically active, the temples suffered neglect. Yet, Babylon's scholarly tradition persisted. Throughout the Persian period, Babylonian astronomers were diligently observing the skies and writing astronomical diaries, detailed records of celestial events, weather, commodity prices, and, of course, political happenings. The Persians, pragmatic rulers as always, often employed Babylonian scholars in their bureaucracy. Babylon also became a center where different cultures met. One document from this era, for instance, is a clay tablet recording the rental of a donkey by a certain Marduk Nadin Anne, with witnesses signing in Aramaic, illustrating Babylon's cosmopolitan nature under the empire. In 331, the old order shifted once more when Alexander the Great defeated the Persians. After his victory at Gaugamela, Alexander entered Babylon, which surrendered to him without resistance. Ancient accounts describe the Babylonians welcoming Alexander as a liberator from the Persian rule, even spreading flower petals in his path. Alexander in turn declared that the gods of Babylon had been slighted by the Persians and promised to restore their temples. Thus he made Babylon one of his imperial capitals. In fact, Alexander envisioned making Babylon the administrative hub of his vast new empire. He began plans to rebuild the Etemenanke ziggurat, which was by then in disrepair or partly demolished. It is said that he ordered his men to clear the rubble of the great tower, intending to rebuild it. But after some weeks of effort, he found the task greater than anticipated. The ruins of that structure had indeed become something of a mountain. But tragically, for the hopes of Babylon, Alexander died right there in the city in 323, in Nebuchadnezzar's palace after a sudden fever. His early death turned Babylon from the seat of an empire into a prize contested by his generals. During the subsequent Hellenistic period, Babylon's fortunes began to wane. One of Alexander's generals, Seleucus, eventually gained control of Mesopotamia. Seleucus I initially took the title of King of Babylon and even minted coins there. But he soon founded a new city, Seleucia on the Tigris, about 50 miles to the north, as his eastern capital. According to later records, in 275 BCE, the Seleucid rulers relocated much of Babylon's population to this new Greek-style city. The motive was likely a strategic one. You see, Seleucia was built on a more easily defensible site, and ultimately closer to the Tigris for trade. As a result, Babylon gradually emptied out. The temple still operated for a time. Records show that Babylon's Temple of Marduk, now sometimes called the Greek name Bel, had priests into the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Hellenistic kings, such as Antiochus IV, are noted to have paid respect at Babylon's shrine. In fact, Antiochus reportedly offered sacrifice at Esagila around 170 BCE. However, as the center of gravity shifted, Babylon's streets began to grow quieter. The Greek settlers preferred Seleucia, while Babylonians either moved or remained in diminishing quarters. But even in decline, Babylon did not immediately become a ghost town. The astronomical diaries kept by Babylonian scholars continue in an unbroken sequence down to at least 60 BCE, suggesting some scholarly community did persist. Now, cuneiform writing as a learned skill continued well into the 1st century AD in Babylonia. The last known cuneiform inscription is often cited as dating to around 75 AD, long after Babylon's political importance had vanished. By the Parthian period, that is, around the 2nd century BCE to the 3rd century CE, Babylon was largely in ruins, though evidence exists of a small village presence and intermittent temple activity. The classical geographer Strabo, writing in the early 1st century BC, remarked that the greater part of Babylon is so deserted that one would not hesitate to say that the great city is a great desert. By Strabo's time, vast portions of Babylon lay abandoned, its once mighty walls broken for brick salvage, and the Euphrates altering course. Later visitors found only scattered ruins identified by locals with names like Babil, the city's memory surviving in Arabic tradition. The rise and fall of Babylon was essentially complete. All the way from humble settlement, it had risen to imperial glory twice, once under Hammurabi and then under Nebuchadnezzar, and then gradually fell under foreign dominion, and finally into obscurity. And so, Babylon's long history, spanning over 15 centuries of recorded time, is a rich tapestry of growth, destruction, and rebirth. We've seen how an unassuming town became the seat of lawgiver Hammurabi's great empire, how it weathered the conquest by the Hittites and rule by the Kassite foreigners, how it endured the oppression of the Assyrians, and then gleamed anew as the splendid capital of Nebuchadnezzar. We also saw how it ultimately bowed to Cyrus and faded under new orders. Through all these changes, Babylon still remained a beacon of Mesopotamian civilization. Its people produced epics and law codes, charted the heavens, and reckoned mathematics. They also built monuments that captured the human imagination for millennia. And crucially, we focused on Babylon through its own lens, not through later legends alone. In those clay tablets and ruins, we find a complex, cosmopolitan city that at times was the center of the world's first true urban civilization, and at times a battleground for larger empires. The legacy of Babylon is not just in biblical or Greek writings, but in tangible contributions, the concept of a 7-day week, a 12-month year, the preservation of Sumerian literature, and the idea of kingship accountable to divine order, all came from this old kingdom. And so, by around the 2nd century CE, Babylon had ceased to exist as a city, but the memory lived on, passed down in texts and myth. When modern archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries excavated Babylon's remains, they uncovered the street where processions passed, the foundations of the ziggurat, and bricks stamped with the name Nebuchadnezzar, physical echoes of those stories told here so long ago. Babylon's rise and fall thus offers a case study in the ebb and flow of human societies, how knowledge and culture can endure even as regimes change, and how a city can be both a real place in time and an eternal symbol of human achievement and ambition. And with that, we get to the end of our talk on Babylon today. What did you think of it? Did you like it? I hope you did. Well, I tell you what, I'll make you a deal. Since you're here 55 minutes into the video, perhaps you can drop a like and subscribe. Tell a few of your friends some little facts about Babylon you heard, Before I go, I'm going to thank the patrons and supporters, those top tier keeping the channel going, keeping it all ad-free and all the rest. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Linda Rees, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfanir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Gugu Bubonic. Thank you so much. And I will see you in the next exploration into the past, whenever you feel like returning. It's all up to you. Good night, everyone. As always, lots of love to you all. Look after yourself and those around you. Good night.